In this episode, we're going to focus on how intelligence stays alive and useful instead of slowly drifting into a one-way broadcast that people stop relying on. Closing stakeholder feedback loops means building a repeatable way for the people who consume intelligence to tell you what worked, what did not, and what they need next, and then using that input to improve future products. Without feedback loops, intelligence teams can become very productive at producing content while still missing what defenders and leaders actually need in the moment. Beginners sometimes assume feedback will arrive automatically if something is wrong. But the most valuable feedback often does not show up on its own because people are busy and because small frictions are easy to tolerate until they accumulate. A closed loop is one where feedback is requested, captured, acted on, and then reported back so stakeholders see their input shaping the next iteration. This creates trust because it shows intelligence is not just talking at the organization, but learning with it. The goal here is to understand how to design these loops so they support continuous improvement without creating extra bureaucracy. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. Stakeholder feedback matters because different stakeholders experience intelligence differently, and what is useful to one group can be useless to another. Frontline defenders need actionable signals, clear scoping guidance, and confidence cues that help them triage quickly. Detection engineers need behavior descriptions, data source implications, and stable patterns that can be translated into detection logic and telemetry requirements. Incident responders need sequencing guidance, evidence preservation priorities, and expectations about adversary adaptation. Leaders need decision-focused summaries, impact framing, and clear status statements that support resource allocation and risk choices. If you do not capture feedback from each group, you will tend to optimize for the loudest group or for the group closest to you, and that can quietly reduce overall program value. Closing loops means deliberately sampling these different perspectives and turning them into improvements that each group can feel. When stakeholders see that their specific needs are being addressed, adoption increases and intelligence becomes a shared asset. This is why feedback loops are not a soft communication practice, but a core operational capability. A common misunderstanding is thinking feedback loops are mainly about asking people if they liked a product, but liking is not the metric. What matters is whether the intelligence changed a decision, improved an action, or reduced uncertainty in a measurable way. If a defender used your guidance to scope correctly and found additional compromised hosts quickly, that is meaningful feedback. If a detection engineer used your technique description to build a new detection that later caught similar behavior, that is meaningful feedback. If a leader used your report to choose a containment option and understood the trade-off clearly, that is meaningful feedback. The loop should capture concrete outcomes, not vague impressions, because concrete outcomes lead to concrete improvements. This is also why feedback should be tied to the original intent of the intelligence product, such as which intelligence requirements, IRS, it was meant to support. When you tie feedback to intent, you avoid improving style while missing function. Closing the loop begins with asking the right questions in the right moments, because timing affects the quality of feedback. If you ask for feedback too late, people forget details and you get generic answers that are hard to act on. If you ask during the peak of an incident, people are too busy and your request becomes noise. A low-friction approach is to gather short feedback soon after key actions or after a decision point, when the experience is still fresh but the immediate pressure has eased. For example, after an incident is stabilized, you can ask responders what guidance was most useful and what was missing when decisions were made quickly. After a detection change is deployed, you can ask whether the signal volume is manageable and whether context is sufficient for triage. After a briefing, you can ask leaders whether the report answered the decision questions they actually had and what they still needed to ask verbally. The goal is to make feedback a normal part of the rhythm, not an extra project that only happens when something goes wrong. Feedback loops also require a way to capture feedback consistently, because ad hoc feedback tends to be biased toward dramatic incidents and strong personalities. Consistency means deciding where feedback lives, how it is recorded, and how it is connected to the intelligence product it references. It also means capturing not only praise and complaints, but also neutral observations like the product was accurate but arrived too late to influence triage. These observations are critical because timing is often a bigger impact driver than content quality. A consistent capture approach also supports auditability and learning because you can later review patterns across feedback rather than relying on memory. Over time, you will notice repeated themes, such as defenders needing clearer scoping guidance or leaders needing clearer statements of what is confirmed. Those repeated themes indicate systemic improvement opportunities rather than one-off fixes. When feedback is consistently captured, iteration becomes evidence-driven rather than opinion-driven. Once feedback is captured, the loop is still not closed unless it is acted on, and this is where many programs stumble. Acting on feedback means translating it into specific changes in how intelligence is produced, formatted, distributed, or updated. If defenders say that indicators were too numerous and hard to prioritize, the change might be to provide fewer, higher confidence signals with clearer relevance explanation. If detection engineers say technique descriptions were too vague to implement, the change might be to add more observable behavior detail and specify which telemetry is needed. If leaders say reports were too technical, the change might be to restructure the narrative around decisions and impact rather than around investigative detail. Acting on feedback does not mean accepting every request, because sometimes stakeholders ask for things that would create new problems, such as demanding a definitive attribution label when evidence is weak. In those cases, acting on feedback might mean explaining why the request cannot be met safely and offering a better alternative. The key is that feedback leads to a deliberate response, not silence. A closed loop also requires telling stakeholders what changed because of their feedback, because otherwise they may not bother providing feedback again. People are more likely to engage when they see that their input leads to improvements that make their work easier. This does not require long announcements, but it does require visible acknowledgement, such as noting that the next report includes clearer confidence language or that the indicator package is now prioritized by relevance. This is not about credit, but about reinforcing the feedback culture. When stakeholders see the program iterating, they begin to treat intelligence as a living service rather than as a static product. This also reduces cynicism, which can develop when people feel that feedback disappears into a void. Over time, closed-loop communication increases trust, and trust increases adoption, which is the ultimate goal. An intelligence program that is not trusted will not be used, no matter how technically correct it is. Closing loops also benefits from setting expectations about what feedback is needed and what kind of feedback is most valuable. Defenders may not know what to comment on unless prompted, and they may default to surface-level feedback like too long or too short. You can guide them toward more useful feedback by focusing on decision points, such as what they did differently because of the intelligence and what evidence they needed that was missing. You can also ask for examples of confusion, such as which parts of the guidance were misinterpreted or which terms were unclear under stress. For detection engineers, you can ask which parts were implementable and which required too much translation, and whether the data sources needed were realistically available. For leaders, you can ask what decision the report supported and whether the trade-offs were clear. This kind of prompting turns feedback into structured input rather than general opinion. When feedback is structured, iteration becomes faster and more effective. A significant challenge is conflicting feedback, because different stakeholders can want opposite things. Leaders may want shorter summaries, while responders may want more technical detail, and both are valid. Closing loops means resolving these conflicts by designing products for different audiences or by layering information so each audience gets what it needs. You might keep a concise decision summary for leaders while providing a deeper operational appendix for technical teams, even if the sharing is controlled. The important part is that you do not compromise usefulness for one audience in order to satisfy another, because that creates friction and reduces adoption. Instead, you treat the differences as design requirements. This approach requires discipline in distribution and sensitivity handling, but it produces higher overall program value. Conflicting feedback is not a failure. It is a signal that the intelligence program serves multiple purposes and needs intentional product design. Feedback loops also connect directly to measurement. because feedback can become a dataset that reveals whether intelligence is improving outcomes over time. If defenders report that they are identifying lateral movement earlier, and incident timelines show reduced dwell time, that is evidence of impact. If detection engineers report that intelligence requirements are being answered more reliably and alert quality improves, that is evidence of impact. If leaders report fewer emergency meetings and clearer decision confidence, that is evidence of impact. These are not perfect measures, but they are meaningful because they tie intelligence to the work it is meant to influence. The feedback loop turns measurement into continuous learning because each cycle produces both a current assessment and a roadmap for improvement. This is how intelligence programs avoid drift, because they can see when products stop being used and can adjust quickly. Feedback loops are therefore not only about improving products, but about keeping the program aligned to evolving threats and evolving organizational needs. Another key point is that feedback loops should be designed to minimize friction for stakeholders, because if feedback is hard to provide, it will not arrive consistently. People will not fill out long surveys after every incident, and they will not attend extra meetings that feel optional. Low-friction feedback can be collected through short, focused questions, quick debriefs, or integrated prompts in existing workflows. The best loops piggyback on work that is already happening, such as post-incident reviews, detection tuning sessions, or regular leadership updates. The idea is to integrate feedback into the rhythm of operations rather than to add a separate layer of process. When feedback is easy, it becomes habitual. When feedback is habitual, iteration becomes natural and continuous. As we wrap up, closing stakeholder feedback loops for iteration means building a repeatable cycle where intelligence is shaped by real-world use and continuously improved. You start by recognizing that different stakeholders need different things, so feedback must be collected across roles, not from a single loud audience. You ask specific, outcome-focused questions at the right times, capture feedback consistently, and translate it into deliberate changes in products, distribution, and clarity. You complete the loop by communicating what changed, so stakeholders see their input matter and keep participating. You manage conflicting feedback by designing layered or audience-specific products rather than compromising usefulness. You use feedback as a measurement input, linking it to detection quality, response speed, and decision clarity over time. Most importantly, you make feedback low friction by integrating it into existing operational rhythms, so the loop can run continuously. When these loops are closed, intelligence stops being a one-way report factory and becomes a learning system that evolves with threats and with the people it serves.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.